In the early hours of April 27, 1865, Chester Berry was asleep on the lower deck of a steamboat on the Mississippi River, heading home after nearly a year in a Confederate prison camp. A piece of cordwood struck him on the head, fracturing his skull and waking him to the sounds of chaos. Hot water was soaking through his blanket. He got to his feet and made his way to the deck. The boat was on fire, and the river was full of men. America was in shock. Just 8 days prior, President Lincoln had been assassinated. The newspapers were full of grief, uncertainty, and everything that comes after 4 years of a bloody civil war. Which is probably why almost nobody noticed when, just after 2 a.m. on the Mississippi River, the worst maritime disaster in American history occurred and then quietly disappeared. The Sultana was a wooden side-wheel steamboat built in 1863 at the John Litherboury Boatyard in Cincinnati, Ohio. 260 feet long, 42 feet wide, certified for a legal passenger load of 376 people. It ran a commercial route between St. Louis and New Orleans and had been in service 2 years without incident. By April 1865, the war was ending. Lee had surrendered at Appomattox on the 9th. Tens of thousands of Union soldiers held in Confederate prisons were moving through parole camps and waiting for northbound transport home. The U.S. government was paying commercial steamboat operators $5 per enlisted man and $10 per officer moved back north to their homes. For a Mississippi River captain, a full load of prisoners was the most lucrative cargo available. Chester Berry was Company 1, 20th Michigan Infantry. He had been captured at Cold Harbor in June 1864, held at Andersonville for the better part of a year, and reached Union lines near Vicksburg on April 1, 1865. He was processed through Camp Fisk, the Army's parole clearinghouse outside Vicksburg, Mississippi, and boarded the Sultana on April 24th. The men around him were the happiest he'd ever seen. They had survived the worst the war could do to them, and now they were going home. Most of the men had come from 2 places. Cahaba Prison in Alabama was a converted cotton warehouse designed for 500 that held over 3,000 men. Andersonville in southwest Georgia was something else entirely. 33,000 men crowded into a stockade built for 10,000, and approximately 13,000 of them had died while being held there. The survivors were severely malnourished, some barely able to walk, many suffering from scurvy and dysentery. They had endured the worst prison conditions of the war. The Sultana was running its regular commercial route, heading toward New Orleans in mid-April 1865. When Captain James Cass Mason docked at Vicksburg, Colonel Reuben Hatch was waiting. Hatch was the Union Army's chief quartermaster at Vicksburg and the officer responsible for assigning prisoner transport contracts to northbound steamboats. He proposed a straightforward arrangement: guarantee Mason the entire prisoner load from Camp Fisk, every available man, in exchange for a kickback from the government transport fees. Mason agreed and pushed south to New Orleans. Hatch had been running schemes like this for years. His Army record documented a long history of corruption and financial fraud before the Sultana arrived at his dock. His older brother, Ozias Hatch, had served as Illinois Secretary of State through 1864 and was a close personal friend to Abraham Lincoln. That connection had protected Reuben before and would protect him again. The Sultana left New Orleans northbound on April 21st, carrying about 70 civilian passengers and a full cargo hold. Approximately 10 hours out from returning to Vicksburg, one of her 4 fire tube boilers sprang a leak, a ruptured seam with a visible bulge in the boiler plate. Running on reduced pressure, the Sultana limped into Vicksburg on April 23rd. The boiler needed repair. The prisoner load Hatch had promised was already assembled and waiting. The mechanic who examined the damage gave his verdict: cut out the ruptured seam entirely and replace it with new material. A proper repair that would require 2 or 3 days. Chief Engineer Nathan Wintringer refused it. Every day lost in Vicksburg risked the prisoner load being redistributed to competing vessels. Wintringer authorized a 1-day patch instead, hammer the bulged plate back into its original position, rivet a thinner plate over the damaged seam, and move on. With the boiler repaired, the Sultana was cleared to load passengers without a pressure test, and no Army inspector examined the vessel's mechanical condition. On the evening of April 24th, Captain George Augustus Williams, a West Point-educated regular Army officer, supervised prisoner loading at the Vicksburg docks. The Camp Fisk records were contradictory and incomplete. Williams believed he was loading fewer than 1,500 men. He was loading 1,950. The decks began to sag under the weight of the men. The same logic that had guided the hasty boiler repair led the crew to install heavy wooden beams to shore up the deck before the vessel departed. The Sultana left Vicksburg carrying 2,127 people on a boat certified for 376. 2 days into the northbound run, the Sultana stopped at Helena, Arkansas. A photographer named Thomas W. Banks captured an image of the vessel at the dock. This was the only known photograph of the Sultana in existence, taken less than 24 hours before the explosion, and it captured every deck covered with soldiers. Men pressed against every railing and surface, with no visible open space anywhere on the boat. That evening, the Sultana arrived at Memphis. Approximately 206 soldiers disembarked, and the crew unloaded 120 tons of sugar from the hold. Around midnight, the vessel took on coal from barges along the riverbank and pushed north into the dark. The Mississippi in April 1865 was at spring flood, running fast and miles wider than its normal channel. The Sultana rode low in the water under its load, tilting and careening as it worked upstream through the current. Inside the boiler room, 4 fire tube boilers ran side by side in an interconnected system, each holding 24 iron flue tubes. Throughout the voyage, Mississippi River water, heavily laden with silt and clay, had been slowly depositing sediment inside the lower flues, building insulating layers between the hot metal and the water meant to cool it, creating hot spots in the iron. Each time the Sultana careened on the flood-swollen river, water inside the raised boilers drained toward the lower ones, partially exposing these compromised flue tubes. The exposed metal spiked in temperature. When the vessel righted, cold water hit superheated iron and flashed instantly to steam, a pressure surge hammering through the interconnected system. Sediment had weakened the metal, the careening had exposed it, and the hasty patch on the damaged boiler was where the system finally gave out. At 2 o'clock in the morning, 7 miles north of Memphis, near a cluster of small islands called Paddy's Hen and Chickens, 3 of the 4 boilers ruptured in rapid sequence. Steam and superheated gas exploded upward at approximately a 45-degree angle, blasting through the crowded decks above and destroying the pilot house. A hole 25 to 30 feet across opened through the center of the vessel. The starboard smokestack fell backward into the blast hole. The port smokestack fell forward onto the upper deck, which then collapsed onto the middle deck below it. The burning coal ignited the wooden superstructure. On the lower deck, Barry was already moving toward the bow. He found his bunkmate, Private Levi Busley of the 5th Michigan Cavalry, scalded to death where they had slept. Below him, the river was literally black with human beings, many of whom were sinking and taking others with them. Barry was a strong swimmer, but he knew he would be pulled under in the chaos if he jumped into the water. He found a piece of cabin door casing to float on. He waited at the bow until the water thinned of the struggling men to where he felt it was safe to enter. Barry jumped into the water and struck out toward a stand of willows he could see by the light of the burning boat. Swimming past the wreck, he looked back and watched a man trapped in the broken wheelhouse burn to death as the flames reached him. He pressed on. The current was working against him without his realizing it. He was swimming upstream and the willows were not getting any closer. The water was cold and his head was pounding from the skull fracture. He was exhausted and losing ground, on the verge of letting go of his board, when he thought of his mother, who had received no word from him in 10 months and had only just learned that he was on his way home. He fiercely clutched the board and, as he later wrote, hissed between my now firmly set teeth, "Mother, by the help of God, your prayer shall be answered." He kept swimming. He found a nearly submerged treetop, climbed it, and fell asleep. He woke sometime after sunrise, delirious, standing on a large snag in the river with the Arkansas shoreline a short distance away. The steamer Pocahontas, sweeping the river for survivors, found him and pulled him aboard. The burned hull of the Sultana sank at approximately 7 o'clock in the morning, 5 hours after the explosion. Bodies drifted south along the flood currents for months. Some recovered as far downstream as Vicksburg, 200 miles away. Many were never recovered. Military investigations conducted over the following 15 years produced 5 conflicting official death counts, ranging from 1,100 to over 1,500. No authoritative passenger manifest had ever existed. The Camp Fisk records were incomplete. The explosion had destroyed the vessel's own documentation, and the flood stage river had scattered bodies across hundreds of miles. The true death toll was never established. Captain Mason had died in the explosion. The most direct line of accountability for the disaster closed with him. The Army court-martialed Captain Frederick Speed, who had organized the prisoner flow from Camp Fisk to the Vicksburg docks, and found him guilty of grossly overcrowding the vessel. The Judge Advocate General of the United States Army then overturned the conviction. Speed, the ruling stated, had been at the parole camp all day and had not personally placed any soldier aboard. He had only directed the operation that put 1,950 men onto one boat. Historians have not found this distinction compelling. Captain George Augustus Williams, the West Point officer who physically supervised loading and put every available man onto the Sultana, was never charged. The institutional army declined to prosecute one of its own. Reuben Hatch resigned his commission immediately after the disaster to avoid court-martial, and refused to honor at least 3 subpoenas over subsequent investigations. His brother Ozias's connections within the Republican establishment provided cover sufficient to block prosecution. Hatch died in 1871 from alcoholism, unindicted. The dollar amount of the kickback went unestablished. The Vicksburg Boilermaker's name appears in no official record. The Army's failure to inspect the vessel before loading and the broader pattern of prisoner transport corruption at Vicksburg went unexamined. Approximately 760 survivors received treatment in Memphis hospitals, of whom 31 died over the following 2 months. The Sultana wreck site is now under a soybean field on the Arkansas side of the river. The main channel has shifted approximately 2 miles east since 1865, leaving the hull 32 feet underground, roughly 4 miles from Memphis. A research expedition located it in 1982. Chester Berry was taken to Washington Hospital in Memphis, where his fractured skull was poorly dressed and the broken bone fragments were not removed. The surgeon told the man in the next bunk that Berry would likely not survive. He was transferred through Cairo in Indianapolis to Tripler Hospital in Columbus, and eventually mustered out at Jackson, Michigan. Months later, his mother received official notice from Washington that her son had been killed in the explosion of the Sultana. His name appears in the Michigan Adjutant General's report for 1865 as killed in action. The official record attributed the explosion to the faulty boiler patch, a repair made 3 days earlier in Vicksburg, rushed, undersized, and signed off by men who had every incentive to keep the boat moving. The inquiry that followed was brief. No criminal charges were ever filed. The owner of the Sultana, who had accepted bribes to overload the vessel, died in the explosion. In a sense, the record closed itself. What the record could not account for was this. Every man who drowned in the Mississippi that morning had survived the war, the POW camps, and starvation. These men were finally on their way home when a corrupted quartermaster, a compliant captain, and a one-day patch on a leaking boiler did what 4 years of war could not. Chester Berry wasn't killed in action. He had survived it all. Andersonville, the Sultana explosion, the Mississippi, and the skull fracture. He spent the next several years submitting paperwork to the United States government to prove he was alive. The pension office required documentation that he had been aboard the Sultana and injured there. Documentation from a vessel that no longer existed, processed through a system that had already declared him dead. He survived that too. In 1892, he published Loss of the Sultana and Reminiscences of Survivors, collecting first-hand accounts from every man he could find who had been aboard. It is the most complete record the disaster ever received. That's the report on the SS Sultana disaster. Thanks for watching Cold Wreckage.